trafficking of children. So thinking about technological advances we've made in our society, we want to think about how this enables crime to be committed, and in particular for our purposes for this class, sexual offenses. So the internet provides a forum for mass distribution of child pornography. It also allows children to be solicited. Cell phones allow us to photograph ourselves, and that also means that children and adolescents might be photographing themselves and potentially sharing those photos and perhaps inappropriate or dangerous photos with peers that may turn around and abuse that trust. The good news is kids are not as uneducated about the dangers of technology and the internet as we sometimes think they are, but they do tend to underestimate dangers of their own behavior. So thinking about the internet, we know that the internet poses several dangers for us in regards to child pornography. First of all, children are exploited for pornographic images, and they're also able to access pornographic images on the internet. And of course, children are solicited online as well. So when we think about child pornography, what are we talking about? We're talking about depictions of sexually explicit behavior that involves someone under the age of 18. And this includes not just actual sexual activity, but anything that's simulated as well. If the child is the focal point of a sexually suggestive setting or an unnatural pose or inappropriate attire, that's also child pornography. If they're depicted in a way that suggests they're willing to engage in sex, and that depiction is intended to elicit a sexual response in the viewer. In 2003, the PROTECT Act made virtual and computer-generated sexual images of children illegal. So not just actual photographs of children, but things that have been computer-generated. The definition of in response to child pornography changes over time. This is a social construct like all deviant behavior, and it's based upon the culture and the time period. So when we think about defining this, international organizations tend to use pretty vague definitions, but they agree on some general tenets. And generally what they're talking about is visual, written, and/or audio depictions of a child engaged in sexual activity or a depiction of the child's genitals. The University of Cork has a Copine project where they've archived child pornographic images and video clips. They created a scale of 10 types of exploitation based upon the method of exploitation and how severe the depicted sexual acts are. And you can read a little bit more about this scale on page 141 in your book. So the growth of pornography on the internet is a result of a couple of different factors. First of all, the internet makes everything pretty accessible to us. Most of us have a phone in our pocket that allows us to access the internet and find pretty much all of human knowledge. It's affordable and it's an anonymous environment. Because it's anonymous, it makes it easy for us to find people who might share similar deviant fantasies to us, and that might help provide some validation or justification. Basically would lower our inhibitions and lessen any social risk. So a lot of times access to child pornography takes place in several different ways. The majority of it is going to require a link to join or some type of group, and they're generally not accessible by the average internet user, but there are open websites as well. And some of these websites are basically run for profit. Because child pornography is enshrouded in secrecy, there are very few comprehensive studies. So the National Juvenile Online Victimization Study was done at the University of New Hampshire's Crimes Against Children Research Center. And they did a two-wave longitudinal study. So 2 waves means it happens in 2 time periods, and longitudinal means we're following something over a period of time. They looked at over 2,500 local, county, and state law enforcement agencies and began by mailing them surveys. In the surveys, they asked them about arrests for internet-related child pornography and sexual exploitation crimes. And then they conducted phone interviews. So some of the things that they found were that 2/3 of offenders who were arrested for internet-facilitated offenses against children had accessed or purchased images on the internet, but they were not actually the people producing those images. Whereas another 1/3 of offenders did produce the images that they were exchanging. Most of these images did depict, indeed, serious sexual abuse. And 89% of offenders had images of kids ages 6 to 12, 40% of kids aged 3 to 5, and another 20% had images of kids under the age of 3. In particular, those using peer-to-peer networks had the most extensive collections and the most disturbing images. So thinking about how big of a problem this is, pornography in general is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and every second $3,000 is spent on pornography. Pornography accounts for 12% of all websites and 1/4 of all search engine requests. Peer-to-peer networks in particular are responsible for over 1/3 of all pornographic downloads. And so this means that the first age at which someone is exposed to pornography on the internet is 11 years old. And 80% of 15 to 17-year-olds have been exposed to hardcore pornography. In 2003, 1 in 4 children who used the internet regularly had been sexually solicited, but by 2006, that number had decreased to 1 in 7. The majority of pornography on the internet is adult images, but child pornography is available through discrete networks and groups. So there's approximately 100,000 websites that have child pornography images, but that number of sites is highly fluid and changes all the time. So what we do know about child pornography comes from individual investigations. So the Interpol Child Sexual Exploitation Image Database has images of more than 2,300 victims from 41 countries, while Copine has 700,000 images and ChildBase has more than 800,000 images. And so these numbers are disturbing, but they're less important than the fact that we have a subculture there that's creating a demand for these images. So how do cyber sex offenders differ from typical sex offenders or quote-unquote regular sex offenders? Well, both have high levels of physical and sexual abuse in their histories. Cyber sex offenders are more likely to be white, single, and younger, whereas sex offenders tend to have higher levels of education than general offenders. Cyber sex offenders tend to be even more educated. So the characteristics of cyber sex offenders remain stable even when the nature of the pornography changes rapidly. Cyber sex offenders who profit from their images are more dangerous for several reasons. First, they're significantly more likely to have prior arrests, both for non-sexual offenses and sexual offenses. They're more likely to have a history of violence, have committed offenses with co-offenders, and to have produced child pornography. And we can classify them in several ways. We could classify them based on their actions, by the frequency with which they send or view pornography, or by the age of their victims. So McLaughlin has a typology where he talks about collectors, manufacturers, travelers, and chatters. So collectors are single, socially isolated. They tend to collect and trade pictures and seek out children with specific characteristics, so they tend to have a preference. They often work in a field where they have a high level of access to children. Manufacturers tend to take photos of children they know in public and post them online. And many have sexually abused children and have convictions for sexual offenses. Travelers tend to chat online and solicit meetings with victims. They usually target teens whom they may groom and pay for travel with them. And finally, chatters chat with victims, often teens, and engage in cyber sex. They groom their victims and try to escalate to phone or in-person contact. They're less interested in child pornography and more interested in erotica. Morgan has a simple typology based on a framework of most offenders, simplest technology, up to the fewest offenders using the more sophisticated technology. So simple users are the majority of offenders, and then we have open traders, closed traders, and experts. Henry did a typology based on psychometric scores, one group being apparently normal, where they have a normal range on psychometric scores, one being inadequate, where there are socio-affective deficits, but they did not score high in pro-offending behaviors, and then deviant offenders who are low in empathy. So what do we know about victims of child pornography? We don't know a whole lot who these children are or their level of their exploitation and victimization. Oftentimes the people who have taken the photos of them are related to them. And once on the internet, it's not always possible to identify their origins. So police have difficulty identifying them, and even after major stings, they often remain anonymous. There's few empirical studies on this because, of course, there are some ethical issues here as to providing access to somebody to this information to study it. And there's some limitations in terms of having strong methodological criteria. Agencies that keep databases do analyze images in an attempt to identify the children, and they periodically report statistics. So NCMEC has identified 1,600 children in photos. Most are young white females, and girls are 4 times more likely to be in images than boys. And the odds of portraying white children are 10 to 1. The Canadian Centre for Child Protection finds that children are sexually assaulted in 36% of images, and 2/3 consisted of children in sexual poses. The younger the children, the more likely they were to be in images depicting sexual abuse. And 2/3 of the extreme images were against very young children under the age of 8. So, do people who view child pornography also abuse children, and are they at risk of abusing children? Again, this is a topic that's still in its infancy and has produced some conflicting results. Also, remember the nature of this activity, because it is so secret, makes it very difficult to study. So first of all, we have low rates of official statistics, and so it's difficult to quantify any overlap here. So most data is reported related to self-reported behavior, and it's very difficult to identify the chronology of the behavior. In what order did certain things take place? There does, however, appear to be some overlap. 12% of cyber offenders had a previous conviction for at least one contact offense. A little over half admitted to having committed a contact offense. 2% committed a contact offense within 2 to 6 years after their conviction, and another 3.5% committed a new cyber offense. There is, however, a subgroup of cyber-only offenders who pose a low risk of recidivating or committing a contact offense. They do tend to differ from the general sex offender population. They have higher levels of victim empathy, fewer cognitive distortions. They have lower levels of impulsivity and lower sex offense convictions. They tend to be higher in self-control and higher in sexual deviancy. They also have more psychological problems in adulthood and score higher on fantasy scales. They have greater connection to fictional characters, and they score lower on sexualized attitudes towards children, emotional congruence with children, and victim empathy distortions. So they tend not to explicitly endorse the sexual abuse of children. So how do we regulate child pornography? Well, the law constantly has to adapt because technology becomes more sophisticated. And as I mentioned earlier, we have jurisdictional issues here as well. So in 1978, we get the first law to explicitly prohibit child pornography, and it applies to kids under the age of 15. Laws have since then expanded the definition, clarified behavior, and raised the age to children under 19. Sometimes it specifies types of images and has increased sanctions as well. In 1982, the Supreme Court held that child pornography is not the same as obscenity and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. It's not considered a free speech issue. In 1986, in U.S. v. Dost, the court clarified what constitutes lascivious exhibition of the genitals or pubic area, and they created a 6-criteria Dost test. And you don't have to meet all of them to be considered for the image to constitute a pornographic image. So in 1996, virtual children are not protected by the Child Pornography Prevention Act, and in Ashcroft v. Free Speech Coalition, acts banning virtual child pornography are constitutionally vague and violate free speech. So basically, virtual images that are not of actual children, are not fundamentally related to the sexual abuse of children. So legislators then begin redrafting the laws, and in 2003, we get the PROTECT Act, which we talked about a few minutes ago. And then rather than criminalizing virtual images, it prohibits the distribution of material that's intended to cause another to believe that images are child pornography. And this act was tested in 2008 in a court case called U.S. v. Williams. It's important because it's restricted the ability to pander child pornography, and it made it possible to charge the business people in the child pornography industry who are earning the profit. This continues, however, to be addressed on a case-by-case basis, and the case law is not resolved on this matter. Courts generally find that virtual images are not covered by the First Amendment. In U.S. v. Hodling in 2011, they looked at a case where they morphed minors' heads onto adult bodies, but the faces of minors were clearly recognizable, creating a risk of harm to their reputation. This allowed the court to deem it child pornography and therefore not covered by the First Amendment. Investigating the possession, distribution, and circulation of child pornography is challenging. Again, we have all the issues related to the internet and anonymity, the fact that this is a global problem, and jurisdiction. There's also little physical evidence on the internet. Generally, we have to target offenders through their conversations and electronic fingerprints. We don't have very good boundaries about how cyber searches can legally take place and which types of searches are constitutional, and this becomes increasingly difficult when we cross jurisdictional lines. We can use wiretaps, and they can be issued where the inception occurs or by consent. In order for it to be a consensual wiretap, consent has to come from the party involved, not the internet service provider. 1998, we have the Child Protector and Sexual Predator Punishment Act, and this mandates that ISPs, so that's your internet provider, report known incidents of child pornography to authorities. But it doesn't require them to actively monitor individual customers or sites, but they could do so to protect themselves. Computers are basically considered containers, and the user does not have a special expectation of privacy. But as with a container, you must have a warrant specifying what is to be searched and what the officer is searching for. So basically, most images that we discovered are discovered during child sexual abuse investigations. Arrests have been increasing, and this is likely due to enhanced law enforcement investigations rather than an actual increase in production. So what about sexting, right? When we send a sexual image to a trusted person, this can lead then to the distribution of this image against our will. And the frequency with which this occurs is difficult to estimate. 1 in 5 teens have either sexted or posted photos like this online, and the consequences can be psychologically damaging. And the states have really had a mixed bag as to how they've dealt with this. So some have made it a registerable sex offense for both senders and recipients who later distribute it. Victims may sometimes be charged with crimes that carry the same penalty because they are the person actually distributing the child pornography. So if you are a minor and you take a picture of yourself that could be deemed pornographic and send it to your boyfriend or your girlfriend, you could be charged with the same crime. There's not a lot of discretion here, and few youth, however, are arrested. So in terms of juvenile prostitution, we want to think about, first of all, the use of this word. When we think about prostitution, we shouldn't really apply this word to juveniles. If juveniles are unable to consent to sex, then they certainly couldn't be an offender in this regard. So basically, we're talking about when someone has exchanged a sexual act for money, drugs, food, or shelter. And the definition really depends on who's defining it. So a lot of times what happens with juveniles is they engage in a lot of what's called survival sex, and this is poorly understood. There may be up to nearly 500,000 youth exploited in prostitution in the U.S. So one way we try to identify this population so we can study them is to use what's called respondent-driven sampling, and it's similar to a snowball sample. So we start systematically recruiting a representative sample of hard-to-reach populations. It's estimated that the size of the juvenile prostitution population in New York City is 4,000, about 10% of which are under the control of a pimp. Females prostituted youth often get involved before the age of 16 and males between the ages of 11 and 13. And youth involved in prostitution are often runaways, victims, witnesses of domestic violence. They have a high risk of engaging in criminal behavior, developing substance abuse problems, and becoming victims of sexual abuse. They're also likely to suffer from depression, self-abusive behavior, and schizophrenia, and have higher risks of unplanned pregnancies and STIs. 87% are interested in leaving, quote, the life, but a lot of times this is difficult for them to do, and there's not a lot of services available to them. Most common services are enforced detention programs, shelters, and safe housing. In 2003, the FBI launched the Innocence Lost Initiative, which sort of reconceptualizes juvenile prostitutes as victims. We also have the Safe Harbor Act, which was developed in 2008 in New York, and other states have followed suit. And it basically decriminalizes first acts of prostitution for youth under 16 and classifies them as a person in need of services and provides services to them. So when we think about trafficking, we're talking about trafficking for sex, trafficking sex that is traded for sex traded, forced labor, debt bondage, and involuntary servitude. Human trafficking is for the sex trade. So this is the transportation of individuals against their will for the purposes of prostitution, pornography, stripping, escort services, and other sexual services. This is worth an estimated $32 to $91 billion a year. And basically, excessive debt is used as a tool to manipulate victims into human trafficking or a promise of money and a better life. So there's a mixture of data here, and trafficking is usually reserved as a term for victims of sexual slavery, but we also talk about smuggling and illegal migration as well. It's difficult to create a definition here due to the differences regarding the notion of consent and the age of the victim. So basically, adults are considered victims if they're subjected to commercial sexual exploitation by force, fraud, or coercion, and a child under the age of 18 is a victim simply based on her age or his age. But we don't have a lot of reliable information here regarding the scope of this. There's a lack of systematic, empirical, methodologically sound research. There's an estimate that there's between 600,000 and 800,000 people trafficked globally annually, and around 15,000 in the U.S. alone, 82% of which are for the sex trade. When we think about how this is portrayed in the media, though, we see third world women and children being brought across borders. We don't think about it happening here within the United States. The Human Trafficking Reporting System looked at 389 incidents that were confirmed human trafficking, which involved 488 suspects and 527 victims. 13% were 25 or older, and sex trafficking victims were more likely to be white or black, and 83% were U.S. citizens. The children most at risk of being trafficked are homeless, have a history of abuse, are in the foster care or child protective service system. So we also want to think about how we have a culture of tolerance towards this and how pimping and prostitution may be glamorized in clothing, songs, TV, and other forms of entertainment. There's 6 factors that account for about 75% of the variance in trafficking. First of all, the most important predictor is there a corrupt government? What percentage of the population is under 14? Infant mortality and food production, population pressure, conflict, and social unrest. We have the first comprehensive federal law in the U.S. to deal with combating human trafficking starts in 2000, and the UN General Assembly adopted an international treaty as well. And this requires countries to criminalize trafficking and related conduct, that they have to also facilitate and accept the return of their trafficked nationals and ensures that that happens safely. They must exchange information aimed at identifying perpetrators and victims and provide or strengthen training for law enforcement, immigration, and other appropriate agencies. They have to agree to strengthen border controls to prevent trafficking, take legislative measures to prevent commercial transport, and take steps to ensure the integrity of travel documents. Victim protection measures are also there. We want to protect the privacy, physical and psychological recovery of victims, and we want to provide for physical safety of trafficking victims as well. We want to ensure that we have laws that provide victims with opportunity to be compensated, and we want to permit them to remain in territories temporarily or permanently. So in the U.S., we have what's called a T visa, and that allows somebody to remain in the U.S. to assist federal authorities with a prosecution. And from 2001 to 2008, the Department of Homeland Security granted 2,000 T visas. And that wraps up this chapter on commercial sexual exploitation of children.